Welcome to the fourth in our series on the history of the Ukrainian people, history of Ukraine. In this program, I'm going to try to deal with this century, the 20th century, beginning around 1905 and ending in 1991, 1992. If ever there was a century in which the Ukrainians experienced the terror of history, it was certainly the 20th. All the suffering that went on in the 19th century actually pales by comparison to what took place in Ukraine in the 20th century. It was a century which saw an artificial famine kill between 5 and 7 million people. We still don't know how many people died in that famine. It was a century in which 2 world wars were fought very, very vigorously on Ukrainian soil. It was a century in which various states advancing their own interests danced through Ukraine, and it was a dance macabre, it was a dance of death. And it's a century that is now ending with Ukrainian independence. And what that implies and what that means, I guess we will have to wait and see. But let's go back to the beginning of the century, 1905 to be precise. 1905 saw a revolution in the Russian Empire. And based on that revolution, a great number of concessions were given to Ukrainians, to Ukrainian intellectuals, in terms of what could be published, what could be printed, and so on and so forth. That's in eastern Ukraine. Western Ukraine, as I had said before, was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And incidentally, the province of Halachina, or Galicia, was probably, people there lived under what were probably the most appalling conditions in the Austrian Empire. And it was from those conditions that they fled as immigrants, starting around 1892, as immigrants coming to Canada. We'll talk about that in the fifth program of the series. But to return to Ukraine around 1905, while their concessions were given, by 1906 the situation again deteriorated. Official Russification was again promoted very actively in Ukraine, and the situation didn't show much of a possibility of improvement on the eve of the First World War. The First World War, of course, was the war that ended both the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, and it was against that backdrop of the end of empires, against the backdrop of the end of the old order, that a new order arose. Now, that order started taking place in Ukraine in about 1917, and it would last till 1921. And what happened was that slowly over the 19th century, Ukrainians were more and more active in cities, living more and more in cities, involved in industrial development, more and more also achieving much better educations. And when 1917 came along and the Russian Empire fell to pieces, a group of Ukrainians seized the opportunity and they declared themselves a directorate, and moves were made to establish a Ukrainian nation state. These were all very young men. They were probably most of them in their 20s. They had a very low opinion of the army. They didn't appreciate the significance of the army. They believed that a lot of things could be achieved through diplomatic means. They were proven wrong, incidentally. When a former officer of the Tsarist army, a Ukrainian by the name of Skoropadsky, offered his troops to them, they turned him down. I really don't want to go into what happened between 1917 and 21, because it would probably take something like 3 to 4 hours to even begin to sketch it. But let's just say this, that this is a period of extreme chaos. The Ukrainian state ceased to exist as such, at least the Ukrainian National Republic ceased to exist in 1921, but when you take into account what was going on at the time, it's not hard to understand why. For example, the armies of the Ukrainian National Republic, which were quite limited, were confronted with having to fight the White Russians. What I mean now, when I say the White Russians, is not the people of Belarus to the north of Ukraine, but rather the White Russian armies, the armies of the people who believed that the Tsar should be returned to the throne, people like Denikin. So there were White Russians. If we can look at our map here, this will just give you some idea of how complicated this whole thing got. Okay, so the Ukrainian state was centered out of Kiev. Meanwhile, Lviv in western Ukraine had also declared a Ukrainian Western National Republic, breaking itself away from the Austro-Hungarians. Okay, so you've got two Ukrainian democratic republics, if you will. Now, down here, in this area, you've got the White Russians invading. In this area, you've got the anarchists, particularly under a man by the name of Nestor Makhno, who were extremely successful at various times. You also had anarchist groups down here, some of which supported the Kiev government, some of which did not. So White Russians, anarchists. From here you have the Red Russians, which is to say the army of the Bolshevik Revolution, right? The Communist Army. The French managed to put an expeditionary force down here, and then you've got the Germans. So that's lots of people to fight with, if you will. During that 3-year period, a lot of fighting did go on. The Directorate was displaced in a coup by a Hetman, so we had a brief return to the Hetmanate. The Hetman was then displaced, and the way the Hetman got in was that he offered to supply wheat to the Germans, and the Germans backed him. The Hetman was set aside, and what was called the Ukrainian People's Republic came into existence, and that in Ukrainian is Ukrainska Narodna Respublika, the UNR. They managed to hold on. They united with the Republic of the West, therefore creating, for a short period of time, a unified Ukraine, only to lose it when the Reds invaded. The Ukrainian armies pulled back, and Ukraine was again partitioned, but partitioned like that, with all of this going to what is today, or what was then the Ukrainian SSR, and this area remaining under Polish protectorate. And there was supposed to be a plebiscite later on to decide whether this western part of Ukraine would become a part of Poland proper, or whether it would continue to exist in a protectorate sort of situation. The war ended by 1921. The capital of Ukraine was no longer Kiev, where it normally had been historically, but instead the capital was moved to Kharkiv in far eastern Ukraine. And the 1920s were actually quite a progressive and interesting period in Ukrainian history. The communists who had won, the Ukrainian communists who had won the revolution and the war, set about to build, quote unquote, their own road to socialism. Incidentally, this was a time of extreme cultural activity. Arts flourished, particularly modernism flourished. Names like Ticina and Khvelevei and Blakitny come to mind. Avant-garde theater in the sense of Kulish. Very interesting music was being written, poetry was being written. It was a time of extreme cultural flowering. However, it should be noted that composers like Stepovey and Leontovich and Stepovey and Stetsenko were all murdered in the early 1920s. So it was a time, on the one hand, of great cultural life. On the other hand, it was a time that was beginning to smack of what was waiting for the Ukrainians in the 1930s, but we'll get to that in a moment. Now, in Western Ukraine, an underground political organization came into existence called the United, or the Unification, or the Association of Ukrainian Nationalists, ОУН, Об'єднання Українських Націоналістів. And this was a very well-organized underground organization. Again, the Poles ruled that part of Ukraine, but to belong to OUN was considered to be, it was being an outlaw, in effect. But the organization was very well developed. It was underground, had connections with its leaders who were mainly located in Western Europe, and it became a hotbed of nationalism, a hotbed that would erupt during the Second World War into political movements which are still with the Ukrainian community to the present. In any event, life in Eastern Ukraine in the 1920s wasn't all that bad. Lenin realized that collectivization would not be the right thing to do at the moment, hence the new economic program, or the new economic policy, which returned land to the peasants. And incidentally, the rulers of Moscow have never really ever figured out how to operate with Ukrainian peasants, but we'll get to that in a moment. In any event, the 1920s came to an end, 1930s began, And as we all know, Lenin had died. There was a tussle for power, and who emerged as victorious from that tussle was none other than Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin was an interesting character. He was the enforcer. He was the guy that when the Bolsheviks needed something done, but they didn't really know how to go about getting it done, like, for example, finding money, they counted on Joe to do it, and Joe did it. Joe didn't often report on what means he used to do it, but if it needed to get done, Joe could get it done. And Joe emerged, or Joseph Stalin emerged, as the #1 man. Now, when Stalin took over, his first move was to concentrate as much power as he could in his own hands. And one of the things that was, shall we say, a pain in his side was the way that the peasants were still sitting on their land. In other words, what Joseph Stalin wanted to see was the industrialization of agriculture. And Ukrainian peasants resisted this very, very adamantly. As a matter of fact, when they tried to collectivize them, people would kill their livestock rather than give it away to the collective farm. They would even destroy their own crops sometimes. This was quite serious. And Joe, or Stalin, and the people near him decided that what was necessary was to break the peasant spirit, to break the peasants once and for all, and then incorporate them into this industrial vision of agriculture, collectivization. How this was done is probably one of the darkest blemishes on, or the darkest shadows, if you will, of the communist order of the former USSR. In 1932, the harvest wasn't very much worse than the year before. The Soviet state requisitioned all grain, including seed grain. And in order to enforce this, cadres were sent from Russia into Ukraine, and they confiscated grain in the fall. That was the autumn of 1932. That year, 1932, that winter, 1932 to 1933, we think that between 5 and 7 million people died of starvation. Now, the reason we say we think is because we really don't know. We don't know because those records weren't kept. In the cities, people managed to survive because, after all, food was needed to have the industrial machinery running. But the countryside was truly awful. Some people estimate as many as 10 million people died that one winter. So this was genocide on the grand scale. And it did succeed in what it set out to do, which is it broke the peasants. The 1930s were a period of extreme terror in Ukraine. In the 1920s, the church was pretty much left to itself. It was scrutinized, but it was left to itself. In the 1930s, there was a full-out campaign against the church, and many of the churches that stood in Kiev, some churches that went back to the 11th century, were summarily destroyed by Stalin's people simply because they weren't needed there anymore. They needed a place for parking or whatever, and churches, monasteries would be destroyed in the most savage of methods. And this went on throughout eastern Ukraine. They would just dynamite churches for something to do. The 1930s also brought with them the Great Purge. That was in 1937. In the Great Purge, again, thousands upon hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians were, quote unquote, exterminated for being suspect nationalists or being suspect this or suspect that. There's a place in Ukraine called Vinnytsia. It's located right there. It's a fairly large community. One evening, hundreds of vehicles arrived at Vinnytsia with men in them. The men dug out a large flat surface. They had their hands tied behind their backs with chicken wire, and 10,000 of them were shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber revolver or rifle in one night. 10,000 were laid to rest in the common grave. They were covered with lime and then with dirt. Sod was placed on top of the dirt. Trees were planted, and it was called the Park of Peace, Education, and Culture. And nobody would have known anything about it had the Second World War not come along and a shell not hit that park, and a shepherd boy's dog brought him a human limb. And then this was excavated. So this was the Great Purge of 1937. So indeed, it was a time of the terror of history. In Western Ukraine, things weren't, they were a lot better, but they weren't great either. The Ukrainians tried to rebel against the Poles. The Poles came in and, in effect, conducted what they called the pacification, the pacificacja, which was very severe. A lot of people ended up in concentration camps. A lot of people ended up getting killed. So basically, the Ukrainians, again, to come up with that line, Ukraine, an easy place to conquer, a very difficult place to rule. And that was certainly being demonstrated yet again, except that Stalin's terror was of such an order that Eastern Ukraine was much more quiet than Western Ukraine. At any rate, the century, just before the middle of the century, of course, the 1930s were coming to an end, the World Depression, and then the world snapped into yet another world war, the Second World War. If the First World War had been fought a great deal in Ukraine, and indeed the front went through Ukraine in a number of places, the Second World War was fought, a deal of the Second World War was fought immediately in Ukraine. What Stalin's strategy was to move everybody who mattered across the Urals. And starting from that power base across the Urals, he pushed his way back in and pushed the Germans out. However, that retreat left the country basically at the hands of the Germans. Now, this poses the question, and the question has been posed, did the Ukrainians collaborate with the Germans? Well, to some extent they did. Certainly in Western Ukraine, where the Austrians had been there before, Ukrainians believed that the Germans were a better bet than the Russians, and of course they had seen the Russians, because when Hitler and Stalin had made the pact, the Poles, basically Poland was partitioned again, and the Western Ukraine ended up in the hands of the Soviets. So the Western Ukrainians had had a chance to see what it meant to be in the hands of the Soviets. Then when the Germans invaded, it seemed to the Ukrainians at first that here they were going to be again inside something not unlike the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with people who you could trust. Well, they learned very quickly that, that in the Mein Kampf, the Ukrainians were number 2 on the list after the Jews. And what the Germans began to do once they'd gotten themselves established was pretty awful. They exported hundreds of thousands of people, in effect, to Germany to work as Eastern laborers, Ostarbeiters. They began to crack down on the intelligentsia very quickly. And meanwhile, in Volhynia, which is the northern part of Ukraine, it's this area in here, the Ukrainian revolutionary or the insurgent army comes into existence and begins to fight with both the Russians and the Germans, the UPA as it is known. And the war rages throughout the entire country. Toward the end of the war, the Russians begin their move back to the east, and they finally take Kiev. However, a story about Kiev itself, when the Soviets were retreating, so this is at the beginning of the war when the Germans are advancing, the Soviets are pulling out. As they left Kiev, they mined great portions of the city. And, for example, the St. Sophia Cathedral that Yaroslav had built back in the 11th century, the Kiev Cave Monastery, and a great many other churches and temples, as well as public buildings, were mined with the intent of blowing them up. And some were. Most of the major churches were not blown up, and that was because the people who were responsible for doing it, in fact, made their own executive decisions about not doing it. There's a number of publications that shows you maps and images of all the monuments of Kiev that didn't survive the 20th century. And it is truly mind-boggling how much of that city was destroyed in the Second World War, starting in the 1930s and then in the Second World War. In any event, when the war ended, for the first time in 300 years, in fact, Ukraine was reunited. Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine became the Ukrainian SSR. And the man who took over after Stalin was, of course, Nikita Khrushchev. And he himself came from the Communist Party, but he came from the Communist Party in Ukraine. He was a Russian himself, but he had a soft spot in his heart for Ukraine. And when he began to expose the crimes of Stalin, one of the things that he did, this part of southern Ukraine, which had not been Ukraine, had been part of the Russian Republic, Khrushchev gave this part of Ukraine to Ukraine as a gift. And the 1950s were a period of reconstruction. Incidentally, the Ukrainian insurgent army, which had fought with the Germans and the Russians in Western Ukraine. When I was in Ukraine recently, I was told that they were still operating in the Carpathians into the mid to the late 50s. So it took the Soviets a long time to do away with this insurgent movement. 1960s came to Ukraine, and interestingly enough, it was not unlike what happened here in North America. The 60s were kind of the time for a new generation. And there was an amazing flowering of cultural life in Ukraine in the 1960s. Also a generation that had not seen the artificial famine, a generation which believed that it lived in a country that was justly constituted by laws, a generation that believed that there was something fundamentally wrong in Ukraine because there were no Ukrainian schools, but there were Russian language schools, a generation that was young and full of itself, and a generation which rather boldly began to assert the right of Ukrainians to speak Ukrainian, the right of Ukrainians to receive services from their government in the Ukrainian language, the right of Ukraine, in effect, constitutionally, to secede from the USSR, should the population so decide. And this went on through the 1960s, and then abruptly ended as the 60s came to an end, into a whole new wave of terror, where, again, thousands of Ukrainians were arrested for anti-Soviet propaganda and agitation. I mean, they had laws coming out of their proverbial to catch people with. It was again a repeat of the Great Purge of the 1930s. I mean, the similar sorts of things were done. You know, you'd be in bed at night, there'd be a knock on the door, it'd be the police. They'd get you up against the wall, and as you had yourself up against the wall, they would plant a book or a brochure under the bed, and suddenly there you were, a propagator of some kind of anti-Soviet propaganda, and you'd get 20 years hard labor and exile. Hard labor and exile, the so-called Siberia, was in fact in the central part of the Siberian area, labor camps that were truly terrifying. And I think if anybody's seen A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich or is acquainted with any of that literature, you'll have some idea of what went on. However, people did manage to survive those camps, and they did continue living, and they did continue writing, and they did continue creating. The 70s were a very oppressive time in Ukraine. On the other hand, they were economically fairly good in the sense that it was being kept falsely afloat. By this time, the Brezhnev-Kosygin regime was in place. Things weren't too bad economically, but in terms of politics, very oppressive. You couldn't study Cossacks, for example, in Ukraine, even as far in as the 1980s. Came the 1980s, came glasnost, came perestroika, and yet another terror, this time the terror of technology. April 1986, the Chernobyl disaster, which spread nuclear waste all over the northern part of Ukraine, and in these days has now entered the food chain, causing much disease and much pollution and all the rest of it. As the 80s drew to a close, again there was a sense that perhaps now is the time, Festivals like the Chervona Ruta Festival held in Chernivtsi in Bukovina, the youth began pushing ever more and more that we want our independence. And of course, as we know, there was the coup attempt in 1991. 1991, in August, the Ukrainian government declared independence. And in December, a plebiscite was held because about 80% of the population is Ukrainian, about 20% or 75% is Ukrainian, 20% Russian, 5% of the other groups that live in Ukraine. And in 1991, December, they held a plebiscite which came through almost to 95% of the country voted for independence. And with that dream that started with Kievska Rus in the 11th, 10th, 9th century was realized. And here we have, as you see on the map, one of the most recent nations in the family of nations. Ukraine, which used to be the Ukrainian SSR, now an independent state, in economic trouble, with many, many challenges still facing it. Where it'll go from here, I hate to be glib, but I suppose the only answer is time will tell. The young are very optimistic. The old are wary. The challenges are enormous. The country has great resources, has great promise. Unfortunately, the people who ran it are still running it. And the question now becomes, how long will it be before a new generation can take the reins and perhaps turn what could have always been a paradise back into something that remotely resembles one? At least that is the challenge before them. In our next program, how the Ukrainians left Ukraine and the centennial of Ukrainian settlement in Canada.